start at 2 Kings 17. Not a lot of looking around this time. There's no Chronicles versions looking at it, so we're looking at 2 Kings 17. We'll go over into Hosea and Micah for a little bit. Again, I have looked at reading on the list, not something we'll do a deep dive into either of these, but I did want to at least look at some passages in there. I had a chance to read through it. At least kind of look over and get an idea of it. And maybe you saw or noticed some ties in what we've been reading that will help you to put those in the proper context. And I want to look at some specific things in there just kind of to tie those together. For now, we're thinking 17. And of course, we talked about we're in the final days or final years of the northern kingdom, which is the 10 tribes, which of course is everybody but Judah and Benjamin, although by this time Benjamin is kind of dwindled away. The 12 tribes, what you start to notice by the time we get to this point, Simeon is essentially gone. It's pretty much been dissolved into Judah. Benjamin is effectively, they don't really have as much territorial meaning anymore. The Ephraim and Manasseh are still a big deal in Israel, in the northern tribes. And of course, Judah is on the southern end. But this is around the time when the Syrians are going to come in and basically run. Let's go and find that today. Let's go to that. We're going to come all the way from over here, from there, which is Assyria. And they're going to come down the valley into Israel. You can see this is kind of where Israel is going to be located down here. This is where Samaria is. So they came a long way, and that gives you an idea of how big the Assyrian Empire is, and how small Israel is. It goes back to kind of what we were saying a while back, which is the more we get into the Old Testament, the smaller Israel starts to become in the scheme of what else going on in the world. And the language ought to have been, the lesson ought to have been for Israel that we're a very, very small part of this. And yet God has called us and made us his chosen people. He has chosen us among all the nations to be his people. And yet, when Samaria is going to fall, one of the biggest problems that they've had, and the problem that Judah has had as well, is that they don't really see themselves as being unique at all. In fact, they want to be just like everybody else. Everything that they seem to do, in fact, it almost goes all the way back to when their first king Saul is appointed. You know, if you remember, why did Israel go to Samuel and say, "Give us a king"? What was the reason? Remember?
So they can be like all the nations around the back.
Be like all the nations. We want to be like everybody else. Everybody else has a king. Why don't we have a king? Everybody else has a big army and a big palace. Saul is over here. If you remember earlier in the story of Saul, he's out. While he has been anointed king, he's out in his field plowing. And he has to put that down and go to work and be king. So they weren't really, the idea of a king in Israel was very, very different back then. And now we're getting to this point where they look just like everybody else. They have the great big palace and the beautiful temple and all the idolatry and things that go with it. And as it turns out, their morality has become such that they basically look like everybody else too. And one of the big lessons, I think, out of the divided kingdom is that once you start looking like the world, you are no longer of use to God or God's people. Because God's purpose for them was that they would stand out. They would be different. They would be lights in that area. Even though they didn't, we don't hear about Israel going out and preaching and teaching and trying to convert people to Jehovah. But at the same time, their influence was supposed to be, you see this examples in the law where Moses writes that when you do these things and God will bless you, they will look at you and say, what God is like this God, and what nation is like this nation that has such a wonderful law. And look at how wonderful everything is in Israel. Look how much God is blessing them. And that should have been the indicator for the people around them to say, maybe their God is a God worth worshiping. Now, ultimately, it happens in exactly the reverse. Even when God blesses them, we go out and we say, well, that's great, but we've got Molech, we've got Baal, we've got all these other gods, and they seem really interesting, and I kind of like that idea. So we find, I forget whether it's Isaiah or somebody who basically says this is an unheard of thing, that a nation would go after the gods of its neighbors after they had defeated those people. The idea that you typically, when you embrace God, you think that God's going to bring you success and going to bring you victory in battle. And yet, this God has brought you victory. Why have you not turned around? And we see a lot of that language in this this chapter in 17:17, and also in some of the passages that we'll look at today. So, the last king of Israel, what was his name? What's the last king before the Assyrians? Hosea. Okay. And it's kind of interesting. If you read in verse 2, it says, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, yet not as the kings of Israel were before him. In other words, he wasn't as bad as some of the other ones. Second Kings. Yeah, there's no Chronicles today. It's strictly Second Kings. 17. Uh, really hard. I'm just trying to get my Bible. I can write it once with just full reading glasses, but then everybody listens to me. So it's kind of clear. So if you'll notice what happens, and this is going to be a common theme as well. Hosea is conquered by Syria, and he becomes basically a vassal state. But he gets tired of doing that. In verse 4, it says that he goes back to Egypt and tries to get Egypt to come help him. And as a result of that, it says that the king of Syria, in verse 5, invaded all the land, came to Samaria, and for 3 years he besieged. So, in other words, he was besieging the city for 3 years. And you can imagine how destructive that would have been. By the way, this is we gave some pictures of Assyria, not Assyria, of Samaria. This is the valley outside of Samaria, and you can kind of see this is why they put it on this pretty large hill. You can see everything around it, which is why they wanted to live there. This is supposed to advance. There it is. This is a part of the wall, probably of Herod's castle. We're not there. Probably Ahab's house. But what you see over here, I thought I'd put a picture of this in too. This is an amphitheater. Thank you. Uh, this was put in by the Greeks, and what that tells you is that when the Assyrians came in, they took all the Israelites, they dispersed them throughout the kingdom, throughout the entire kingdom of Assyria, and they brought in people from all different nations. And that's really typically what you would do. When you invaded a country, the last thing you wanted them to do was to revolt, right? To rise up and have some sort of a feeling of nationalism and pride in your nation. So what do? Well, let's just get rid of everybody that lives here and bring in the people that have absolutely no ties to this nation whatsoever, and they'll just all live together as one nation, which is, as I say that, kind of like what happens when you take a nation that used to be homogenous and had a common identity and common goals and common values, and you bring in a whole bunch of people that don't share that at all. What happens to the strength of that nation? It's gone. There's no unity. It's divisive. I feel like I'm starting to talk about things that are going on today almost. But that's kind of the idea. That's how you keep a nation powerless. You've got a big empire like Assyria. I want to make sure that none of these people ever get enough unity involved where they can rise up and actually deal with it. And so that's what we see happening here. It says in the ninth year of Hosea, verse 6, the king of Syria captured Samaria. He carried the Israelites away and placed them in Hala, Abram, the river Gozan, and all the cities of the Medes. So basically, got to put it the other way. As you can see, all through this area, you're going to have people who are descendants of Abraham. Now, what's useful to know about it is that when you flip over to Acts chapter, and you read something kind of interesting. In Acts chapter 2, what's going on in Acts chapter 2? What's the feast? Day of Pentecost. This is one of 3 feasts that the Jews are required by law to come together into Jerusalem and celebrate before God. And if you'll notice what he says, if you go down to verse 8, this is after the apostles spoken in tongues. And we learned, they're saying, are not all these who speak Galileans? In verse 8, how is it to hear each of us in his own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of for instance, in Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, all that stuff, all those names are from these areas, all the way over here to the Medes. So you've got people who have been dispersed throughout the Syrian Empire during this time. They continue to identify as Jews. They continue to have that connection to some degree. Oh, sorry. I must have accidentally clicked it. They continue to have that connection to Israel. And as a result of that, how many people are going to hear about God, are going to learn about God that never knew about God? You know, how many of these people, do you think any of these people had ever heard of, of Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob? Maybe a long, long time ago. How many of them had heard about what happened when God brought the Israelites out of Egypt? Probably not a lot. But now, because of this, all of a sudden you've got Jews spread out throughout this entire area, and the seed slowly begins to get sown to where when the time is right and the gospel is going to go out, all of a sudden you've got people all over the world that at least have a basic idea of the God of Israel and have a connection to those promises. And so it's a great example of how even when God punishes his people, he does it with the eye of ultimately bringing a blessing and causing good things to happen as a result of that. And so even during this time, as bad as things are going here, you start to see God laying the groundwork for what's eventually going to happen in Jesus. And so we read these people go into exile, and he goes through and rattles off a number of the things that they had done, and a lot of these, you know, we've talked about all of these before. They're not new, but what are the the accusations that the writer brings up against Israel? What did they do that brought all this about? Okay, their idolatry.
What was the question, Karen?
What did they do that got them into captivity? Why did they get sent off to captivity? Idolatry.
They did secretly against the Lord their God.
Okay.
Town
Hmm.
to set up themselves pillars and Asherah on every hill and under every green tree, and there they made all these high places. Nations did from the Lord carried away before them.
Mhm.
And said to them, "You shall not do this."
Yeah, it's the same types of things. If you'll notice, and if you go back even to verse 7, when it says, "This occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt." Notice how he starts this. They,
Way back.
yeah, all the way back then, and he makes sure to make the point of they sinned against the Lord their God, who did what? Yeah, God brought them out. God was the reason they're here to begin with. God has established them. He's done all these things. He's freed them from Pharaoh. He freed you from a tyrannical emperor. And now, guess where you are? You're under another tyrannical emperor, and once again you've been removed from your land, and you've once again been enslaved. And he says that, you know, God did this for you, and yet what did you do? He says in verse 8, you walked in the custom of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, which is exactly what he told them not to do, right? Don't follow their customs, don't worship their gods, don't intermarry with them. And instead, the response is, no, we want to be like them. Uh, and and again, it's one of those things where I hate to keep talking about Israel because it makes it sound like, you know, when you go there and you see how small this area is, and you start to realize, for example, the one thing I think to me when we went down to Gezer, which is an area where Samson was living and did all the things that he did, and you go into the valley and you look and they say, okay, here is the village where the Israelites lived right here. And as you walk, all you got to do is walk down the valley for about 30 minutes and see where that hill is over there. That's where the Philistines lived. It's not as if they were separated by mountain ranges and miles and miles and miles of empty country. They lived together. I mean, they probably had trade. Well, they had trade routes back and forth. They saw each other at wells. There was a lot of contact between them and these other nations. And God tells them going in, you cannot allow that to influence you.
You can't allow those other nations to draw you into them, which is why they weren't supposed to make covenants with these people. They weren't supposed to intermarry with them and do these other things. And yet what happens is the Israelites come in and they say to yourself, you know what? We could make a lot of money on this olive oil, but I don't have any way to ship it. Now, the Philistines have a lot of port cities over here. So maybe if we dealt with them and had business relationships with them, they could handle that, and we can all be rich. It's things that the world looks at and says this was real progress and evolution of this culture. The Bible sees very differently, and you start to see the results of that over time. Um, Eventually it corroded their own culture. It caused them to leave God and serve other idols, and again be basically like the other nations. I like how it's said in verse 15. It says they despised his statutes and his covenant that he made with their fathers and the warnings that he gave them. They went after false idols and became false. Does anybody have another translation of that? Anybody not have ESV?
Verse 15.
Verse 15, yeah.
They follow vanity and they vain
Okay.
things surrounding them.
Okay. They yeah, they followed vanity and became vain. The idea that you sought after something that was empty and meaningless. As a result of that, you became empty and meaningless. I just think that's one of the most American Standard. I always think that's one of the most powerful, and maybe even almost the central passage in this verse, in this chapter. The idea that because this was what you cared about, your whole existence becomes meaningless. You're every bit as empty as all these other nations that are running around trying to find meaning in their lives without God, and you have emptied yourself of that meaning too. Mhm.
The KDT's
Yeah.
little first here when it says they rejected his rule, the covenant he had made with their ancestors, and the laws he had commanded them to obey. They paid allegiance to worthless idols and became worthless to the Lord.
Exactly. You're of no value anymore when you decide to make yourself just like everybody else. Again, if we learn nothing else from the story of idolatry and the story of the divided kingdom, it's that God's people have to remain separate. God's people have to remain pure and holy. It doesn't mean we're separate from the world. It doesn't mean we ever have no contact with the world, but we can't look like the world, and we can't have the same concerns as the world does. And too often that it's it's almost impossible not to at least to look a little bit like the world. But the question then becomes, how much are we allowing that line to get blurred? Can people tell that they're around people who are different when they're with us? And so that's the idea. And of course, it goes down in verse 16 where it gets even worse when it says they made an Asherah and worshipped all the hosts of heaven and served Baal. And they burned their sons and their daughters as offerings and used divination and omens, sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Um, and I think that's especially um, where does he go down? I was looking for the reference to the prophets where he says, and maybe I may have passed it up at the end of verse 13. Yeah, up in verse 13, where it says, "Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes in accordance with all the law that I commanded your father, that I sent to you by my servants the prophets. But they would not listen, but they were stubborn." Now, and if you go down to what we just read, what are they doing? Well, I won't listen to the prophets, but it says they use divinations and omens, and if only God would tell us what He wants. If only God would tell us what to do. Well, and here's Elijah going, "This is what God wants you to do." This is Hosea and Micah and Amos and all these men coming. This is God's message. Well, we don't want to hear that. And we'll see a little bit of that language, particularly in Micah. Some of the ways that some of the attitudes that they had. So as a result of this, they're scattered around. Now, something really interesting happens here. As I mentioned, the Assyrians, which is what they did pretty much in all the cities that they captured or regions they captured. They brought in a bunch of people. They sent home a bunch of people. They scattered a bunch of people. So you've got a mix of people in this area. So what's the first thing that we read about happening to these people once they get settled in Samaria? Yeah, they get attacked by a bunch of lions. And it says at verse 25, at the beginning of their dwelling there, they did not fear the Lord. Therefore, the Lord sent lions among them, which killed them. And the Assyrian response to this is what?
Well, it's a good priest in there that knows.
Yeah, yeah, they're so close, right? Clearly, the God of Israel is not happy with what's going on here. We need to learn what to do in order to please this God. And so, who do they go get?
One of the places.
One of the priests. One of the priests from where? From some,
Then they sent to Assyria.
yeah, from one of the Samaritan priests, Samaritan, or one of the Israelite priests that was sent off into captivity. But what's the problem with that priest?
What is that?
Yeah, he's not a Levite for one thing.
Supposed to.
Yeah, yeah, he's not even supposed to be a priest. He mhm. Yeah, yeah,
Shrines of high places.
yeah. There's two issues. One, you bring in somebody that already he hasn't. The whole point of him being sent into captivity is that he wasn't following the law that he supposedly knows. So he's not really teaching you the truth anyway. And secondly, as you just said, even though they say, all right, we're going to serve God, we want to do what God tells us to do, but we're also going to serve these other gods. We're going to continue to do the things that we were doing. We're just going to add him in because that's how people viewed gods back then. I can worship a whole if I worship one God, I worship two must be better. Worshiping three, I'll worship whatever God that you see so that we can cover our bases. So they really didn't see the God of Israel as a God to truly be devoted to or focused on.
They didn't say, okay, this God of Israel is the one that's sending these lions.
Yeah.
To him.
Hmm.
It was to listen to him too.
Yeah.
In addition to all these earth.
Exactly.
That's pretty common
Oh, absolutely.
today. That in cultures that have gods, when
Hmm.
Christians will go
Yeah.
try to convert them, they'll be like, oh, okay, we can worship this Jesus, and they take the cross and they put it same row as over.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, because it gets back to the idea that there's still one more idea that needs to be there, which is God is Lord of Lords. He is God of all gods. There is no other God but Him. He is the greatest of all gods, and again, He does not share worship. And again, if they were talking to a priest that was actually true to God, they might have heard that message, and maybe they did. Yeah.
Known God.
Hmm.
Right?
Yep. We'll cover our bases, and which is I think what makes it really interesting when he talks about the idea of the attitude of the people in this area. And if you read this, it almost sounds a little confusing because if you read, for example, in verse, let's see, well, let's start in verse 32. Um, it says they also feared the Lord and appointed from among themselves all sorts of people as priests of the high places who sacrificed for them in the shrines of the high places. Basically, exactly what they've been doing before. So they feared the Lord, but they also served their other gods, after the manner of the nations from among whom they had been carried away. To this day they do according to the former manner. They do not fear the Lord, and they do not follow the statutes or the rules or the laws or the commandments that the Lord commanded the children of Jacob whom he named Israel. Again, there's that emphasis. These are God's children. He gave you a name. He gave you purpose. He brought you here, but you don't fear him. And what I think is interesting about that is if you'll notice within a couple of verses, it almost seems like it contradicts itself, doesn't it? Because it says in verse 33, they feared the Lord, but in verse 34, it says they do not fear the Lord. How would you explain that? What is that? What does he mean by that?
Because there is no half portion of the Lord.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. There's a sense in which that's not the fear of the Lord to worship God halfway. But how can I fear the Lord and not fear the Lord?
They feared it because of the lion.
Okay. Yeah.
But they didn't fear him as the creator and sustainer.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a very different. In fact, what was interesting about this, I was just curious about this, and I didn't dig too deep into it because I don't know Hebrew, less Hebrew than I even know Greek. But there's three different words that are used for fear in this passage, which explains a lot. Because, for example, in verse 17, it's verse 7, where you go up and it says, And this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, uh, and feared other gods. It's the same word is used down, for example, in verse 28, where it says, "So one of the priests whom they carried away from Samaria came and lived in Bethel and taught them how they should fear the Lord." So in other words, it's the idea of the same kind of fear, the same kind of regard and worship that you would use for any other god. Continue on that idea of fear or regard or worship to some degree, but it's not focused on God. There's another idea when it talks about the idea that they did not fear the Lord. They feared the Lord when the lions came because we were motivated to do something. But I have no regard for the Lord because I'm not willing to listen to everything that He has said.
Fear the Lord. Pleasing Him. Doing His commandments, but at the same time, we're not taking God and His law serious.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They don't see Him as any different than any other God. There's nothing special about this God. It's just like one of the other ones, and that's how we're going to treat Him. That's not fearing the Lord. Because if that's my view of the Lord, how much do I really understand the Lord? Yeah, that's not really. I don't really understand God if I think that God is going to be okay with that, and I can't really truly fear the Lord if I don't really understand the Lord. If that makes sense, it's kind of like saying I can't. I love the Lord. Well, what do you know about Him? I don't know. It's in the Bible. I don't know. I know He's God and He created the world, and therefore I love Him. That's not really. A lot of times, what we'll do is people in the world will create their own version of what God is and say, "I love this God." But if I describe to you the God in the Bible, well, I don't really love that God so much because He does a lot of things that I don't like. He does a lot of things I don't agree with. And I suspect that's kind of what you see with these people. There's a lot of things about God that are pretty great, but I don't like the fact that He won't let me sacrifice my child on an altar. And so as a result of that, that's what you see. And and I will say there's some discussions on this, and I didn't get too deeply into it, but when we get to the time of Jesus, who's living in this area, in this region of Samaria? Samaritans. All right. What do we know? What do we know about the Samaritans of that day? What was their relationship to God? Anybody know? Take the woman at the well, for example. Okay. Yeah, she needed to repent. What was her thoughts about God? What do we know about what she viewed as worshiping God? What was it? You remember what the question she asked Jesus? Yeah. Where were we supposed to worship? Where did she think? Yeah. Yeah. We worship up on Mount Gerizim because that's where our fathers. And by the way, who was her father? Do you remember who she named? Jacob. Our father Jacob, our father Israel. We're just as much children of Israel as you are, but they didn't believe in anything other than the first 5 books of the law. In fact, they rejected even that, really. They didn't believe you needed to worship in the temple in Jerusalem. They thought that was just an invention of those people up there. So they had an understanding of God, but it wasn't really based on the knowledge of the Word of God. It was based on the teachings of their ancestors. And that's another one that kind of struck home to me, the idea that how many people do we know in the Lord's church whose connection to what we do every Sunday is because that's just what we believe. That's just what the church does. That's what I've grown up with. Why don't we worship with instruments? Why do we serve the Lord's Supper every Sunday? Why don't we have an orphan home out back? Why don't we have a fellowship hall? Why don't we do the things that, we just don't, because that's what those people over there do. Yeah. And that's the issue that sometimes we can have, and we find ourselves in the same kind of religious attitude. When my view of what I believe and what I practice before God is dependent on what my ancestors told me, or what my parents and what my grandparents did when they worshiped, what am I dependent on? Yeah, they've got to be right. If they're not right, I'm in trouble. Uh, and as it happens, that's exactly the situation that these people are in. You're going to get to the days when Jesus is there, and these people are firmly convinced that they're doing what God wants because it's what we've always done. And so, as a result of that, you kind of see the seeds of that being sown here. And it all goes back to the idea that at some point in time, somebody that you trusted said, I'm not going to do what God's called us to do. I'm going to set up a new way of doing things. We're going to have golden calves in Dan and Bethel. We're going to have priests from all the tribes. We're going to have different feast days. We're not going to do what the law says. And my ancestors said, okay, we'll go along with that. And generations later, nobody knows the difference. One of the passages in Hosea, and we may skim over it later on, says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Yeah, yeah. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
Syrian gods.
Hmm.
The only one till soon. It's a slow process. They allow for minute things, and they're the big things are okay too.
Absolutely. So in Hosea prophesied a little earlier. It's a little bit unclear on some of these, but at the we know that he prophesied during the time of Jeroboam the second, which is this guy here, some probably 50 years or so, or 60 years or so before Israel eventually would be invaded. But during the time that Jeroboam, if you remember, we talked about this a few weeks ago, Israel has become popular. They've become powerful. Their kingdom has grown. They're rich. They're doing really well. God has blessed them. And yet Jeroboam continues on in the sins that God had that his ancestor had started. Not his ancestor, actually. He's not the seed of Jeroboam, but his namesake, I should say. uh, Despite the prophets coming to him and warning him and trying to call him back, and despite the prophets that have continued to come and tried to call them back, and as a result of that, I asked in this first question, or this question, what's the imagery, the prophecy in these first two chapters? How does Hosea describe the relationship between God and Israel? How does he illustrate it? A husband and a wife, but not just a wife, right? How does what was Hosea's wife's profession? She's a prostitute. And God says, go take yourself a wife of whoredom. Go marry a prostitute and have children. And I think it's a little bit different for us today. Not to say that we don't think that's gross today. To us, as bad as it is, to them, that's unthinkable. There's no way that I, as a pure, upright Jew, would ever touch a woman like that. It would not happen. And yet he says, I want you to go, and I want you to have 3 kids with her. And notice the names that he gives them. First of all, the first one is call his name Jezreel. For in a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel. And now, this is another example of why we study the divided kingdom, so I can understand what he's talking about here. Anybody remember what Jehu's sin was that we talked about? Killed a whole lot of people, right? He was God told him, I want you to wipe out the seed of Ahab. And Jehu said, you bet, I'm going to go do that. And beyond that, he did a lot more. He killed anybody that even knew Ahab. Uh, it's over in 2 Kings 10, if you're looking. Well, chapter 10, verse 11, where it says, Jehu struck down all who remained of the house of Ahab in Jezreel, all his great men, his close friends, his priests, until he had left none remaining. So yeah. And that, by the way, did God call him to do that? Yeah. That was God sends Elisha sends somebody and says, go anoint this man king over Israel. God's will is that you take the throne and you wipe out Ahab. So he does that, but he takes it upon himself to do even more. And what's worse about that is that once he is installed, does he change anything? I mean, he gets rid of the idolatry. Jeez, that's a good way to describe it, because that's exactly what he does. But he doesn't change any things that Jeroboam had originally done. They're still worshiping at Dan and Bethel. They still have the calves. They're still doing all those things. Nothing has changed. And so he says, I'm going to punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel. He goes on, the second child says, conceives again and bore a daughter in verse 6. And the Lord said to him, call her name No Mercy, for I will have no more mercy on the house of Israel to forgive them all. But I will have mercy on the house of Judah. How's that fair, by the way? Is Judah any better than Israel? In some ways, But as Paul kind of points out in Romans, the ways that they're better actually makes them worse because you ought to know better. You've got the law, you've got the temple, you've got everything there. There is no reason that you should be doing what they're doing here, and yet you're doing not only what they're doing, you're doing even worse. Ezekiel talks about that. We won't get into that obviously, but they're going even worse. And yet he says, "I'm going to have mercy on Judah, but I'm not going to have mercy on Israel." Why?
Judah was the root
Yeah.
Satan would come.
Because God had made a promise to David, and He had made a promise to Abraham. It's remarkable how we see again, as bad as things get, God made a promise to Abraham and He fulfills it. He made a promise to David and He fulfills it. Even despite all, there's nobody in the seed line of David that was warranted that. Some of them more so than others. There were some times, in fact, when the seed line was almost ready to be gone, if not for divine providence, which allows it to continue on. But God continues that and keeps that in place. And it's not because Judah was doing such a great job. Yeah, I've reserved a remnant. And he talks about that idea of a remnant returning. Uh, so the third child, he says in verse 8, he says, "When you have weaned no mercy, she can be conceived and bore a son. The Lord said, call his name not my people, for you are not my people, and I am not your God." Yeah, this is how bad it's become, Israel. You are not my people anymore. I'm not your God anymore. I have the relationship of someone who has gone in to see a prostitute. We have no connection. We have no relationship. Is there any hope for that relationship? If you were, frankly, a lot of people in the world today, I mean, if you were talking about somebody whose spouse prostituted themselves while they were married and they divorced him, we would say you've got every right to do it, and probably a good thing that you did. Is there any reason in the world that I would ever take that person back? No. Why would you want that? You wouldn't. Only if God told you to. Right. Exactly. And God says, Hosea, I want you to take this woman. I want you to have children with her. Why is that? What's the point of all this? One, so you can feel what I feel. You know what it's like to have a wife who has been completely unfaithful to you. Why else? Go down to the end. Um, in chapter 2. Hmm? In chapter 2, not the end, real quickly. He's describing what's going to happen to, in fact, in verse 2, plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife and I'm not her husband, that she put away her whoring from her face and her adultery from between her breasts. In other words, the husband here is saying, look, I know you've corrupted yourself, but if you'll just stop doing it, you can come back. That couldn't have happened with anybody else. It's too late. You're corrupted. You can't. Everything has changed. It'll never be the same again. And yet God says, just stop doing what you're doing and come back, and we can have that relationship again. He goes down. He talks about how she's cheated on him. She's done all these other things. But in verse 14, he says, "Therefore, behold, I will allure her. I will bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her." When we talk about bringing somebody into the wilderness, whenever the people go into the wilderness, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's not a good thing. No, you're going into the wilderness, you've got nothing. You're being taken. Everything is being taken away from you. And yet, he says, once I've done that, what am I going to do? I'm going to speak tenderly to her.
He takes her in the wilderness. Now they're alone together.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. Because that's the point of all of this, right? The idea that when I take everything from you, and when I bring you out to the wilderness and you see what you are and what has happened to you, what's going to happen? You're going to come back. You're going to listen to me again. And he says, in that day, in verse 16, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband, and no longer will you call me my Baal. In other words, you're not going to worship Baal anymore. And he talks about, I will make in verse 18 a covenant with them on that day with the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, and the creeping things of the ground. And I will abolish the bow and the sword, the war from the land. I will make you lie down in safety. And I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in steadfast love and in mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know that I am the Lord. And why do we study this? That's why. Because we see that despite all that they have done, God says, I'm going to still have mercy on you. And in verse 23, it says, I love how he brings it back to the very beginning. In verse 23, he says, I will sow her for myself in the land, and I will have mercy on no mercy. And I will say not my people, you are my people, and he shall say, you are my God. He goes, all the things that I named you before, they're gone. And we'll go back to the way things were. In fact, it will be even better. It's just an amazing passage. I'd love to spend more time on it, but I know we're almost out of time anyway. Um, I want to make a point on this question in Micah. Again, we need to do a minor prophet study because there's so much good stuff in here. But I did want to look at one thing that I found particularly interesting. Hopefully, if you read through this, in fact, I will make one point before we do that. One of the things that Micah brings out, and I mentioned it earlier, is what brought the people of Judah into this position. Now, Hosea talked mostly to Israel. Micah is talking mostly to Judah. And the idea is that you're having the same problems that Israel had. You're the same kind of idolatry. And he talks really about both of them. And the idea that how they have fallen and how they've been destroyed. Um, if you notice something, let's see where it is. Yeah, go to verse chapter 2, verse 4. Yeah, Micah chapter 2, verse 4. Uh, he's been talking about what he's going to do to the people of Judah. It says, in that day they shall take up a taunt song against you and moan bitterly and say, we are utterly ruined. He changes the portions of my people, how he removes it from me. To an apostate he allots our fields. In other words, these are the fields that you promised us, God. You gave us these when we came into Canaan. And look at what you've done. You've given them to a bunch of apostates, people who are worse than we are. Therefore, he says, you will have none to cast the line by lot in the assembly of the Lord. In other words, the idea of casting the line by lot means that when it's referring back to when they had the inheritance allotted in the beginning and they figured out who was going to live who. So when God reallots this land, you're not going to be invited into this. You're not going to get any of this. And it says in verse 6, do not preach, thus they preach. One should not preach of such things. Disgrace will not overtake us. Should this be said, O house of Jacob? Has the Lord grown impatient? Are these his deeds? Do not my words do good to him who walks uprightly? But lately my people have risen up as an enemy. You strip the rich robe from those who pass by trustingly with no thought of war. Let's see the alternate. Or returning from war. The woman of my people you drive out from their delightful houses. From their young children you take away my splendor and go. Uh, the idea that you want to tell me as a prophet, don't preach about these things. Don't talk about things like this. Don't say bad things. He says in verse 11, it's one of my favorite passages. If a man should go about and utter winds and lies, saying, I will preach to you of wine and strong drink, he would be the preacher for this people. In other words, you just want somebody to come and tell you how wonderful everything is, to eat, drink, and be merry. That's the guy that you want preaching to you. He says, I'm not going to do that. And he continues to talk about this idea that you got leaders, as it says in chapter 3, verse 5, who lead my people astray, who cry peace when they have something to eat, but declare war against him who puts nothing into their mouth. In other words, I can prophesy for you if you want. Okay, what are you going to have to say? Well, I don't know. What do you want me to say? What do you have for me? Well, I'll give you that plot of land over there. It's going to be great for you. God's going to bless you. It's going to be wonderful. That's great. That's what I want to hear. Here's your payment. The idea that I know as a prophet that I can do really well if I'll tell people what they want to hear. And that's the nation that's the climate of the religion at that time. And down in verse 11 of that passage, it says, its heads give judgment for a bribe, its priests teach for a price, its prophets practice divination for money. Yet they lean on the Lord and say, is not the Lord in the midst of us? No disaster shall overcome us. We got the temple. Everything's fine. How can you say things are going to be bad? Things are fine. We're talking about God. We're offering sacrifices, we're doing all the things that we ought to be doing. And that's the climate that we're dealing with in Judah. And I'm going to skip ahead because I know we got I know I'm going over time, and I apologize for that. But one quick thing I want to look at in chapter 7. I asked this question, and I could ask this about chapter 5 and chapter 6 and chapter 7 as well. But if you had a chance to read this, did you see anything in this chapter that made you think about the prophecy of Christ? Yeah, or for that matter, if you saw them in other ones too. There's several passages in here that are either cited or are pointing towards what's going to happen in the day of the Lord.
Verse 7
Mhm.
says, "But as for me, I will wait for the God of my salvation, my God will hear me."
Which chapter is that?
So
7. Okay. Okay. Mhm.
so that speaks to the promise of deliverance,
Yeah.
salvation, or restoration.
Yeah. And do you notice something, by the way? I'd never noticed this until this week. When he says in verse 5, put no trust in a neighbor, have no confidence in a friend, guard the door of your mouth from her who lies in your arms, for the son treats the father with contempt. The daughter rises up against her mother, the daughter in law against her mother in law. The man's enemies are the men of his own house. Does that sound familiar? Who quoted that? Yeah, that's what Jesus said. Yeah, that's what I came to do. And I find it really interesting that this is not a passage that you would typically look at, and certainly the Jews didn't look at it as a prophecy of Christ. But look at what he's saying. Look, I'm going to come and I'm going to divide people against their households. That's kind of what the prophets were doing during this time in the immediate sense, but it's also what Jesus did. He says, I will trust in God. I will look to the Lord. And he says in verse 8, rejoice not over me, O my enemy. When I fall, I shall rise. When I sit in darkness, the Lord will be a light to me. What are we talking about here? I don't know if it's a direct statement, but when Jesus said, if this is what Jesus is alluding to, when he talks about when I fall, I shall rise, what's he talking about? The resurrection. I don't know if it's a direct, but I always wonder whether Christ was quoting this passage as a not so subtle reminder that I'm going to set one against the other, and there's going to be a lot of conflict over me, and some really bad things are going to happen. But don't think for a minute that when it looks like I've been defeated, that I'm going to fall. He says, I'm going to rise. I will bear the indignation in verse 9 of the Lord because I have sinned against him until he pleads my cause and executes judgment for me. He will bring me out to light. I shall look upon his vindication. In other words, he will show me to be righteous in all this. Then my enemy will see, and shame will cover her who said to me, where is the Lord your God? My eye will look upon her. Now she will be trampled down like the mire of the streets. That idea of finally redeeming the one who has been vilified and showing that this is in fact the one who's came from God, the one who was right all along. And I love how it ends in verse 14. Shepherd your people with your staff, flock of your inheritance, who dwells alone in the forest in the midst of a garden land. Let them graze in Bashan and Gilead as in the days of old. As in the days when you came out of the land of Egypt, I will show them marvelous things. Uh, we want to get into the rest of it because there's a lot more we could talk about. But you start to see again how the prophets are giving them hope during this time. As bad as things are, first of all, you're delusional in your idea that you're pleasing God. You're not. This is what's going to happen to you if you don't repent. But don't think that because God is bringing all this on you that has to be the end of things. Because as bad as things get, God still has a way forward for you if you're willing to take it. So anyway, that's thoughts. Any thoughts or comments on anything that you read that you want to bring up before I give it over to Dan? We just breezed through two minor prophet books, and there's so much we could talk about. But we'll go ahead and stop there. I'll let you have it.